If you were born somewhere around the year 2000, I'm sure you can remember what an exciting time it was in the late 2000s and early 2010s for mobile gaming. The first iPhone had only just been released a couple of years ago, and smartphones in general were still very much finding their footing. Many people bought their first smartphone around this time, and looking back, there was so much excitement going around about all the capabilities that smartphones brought with them. The cameras, the apps, and most importantly for this video, the games. Developers back then had to deal with pretty severe limitations of the hardware that they were running on. The small screens, the weak specs, and the lack of buttons all were major hurdles for developers. On top of that, major game developers weren't that invested in mobile yet, so most games were made by small to mid-level developers with relatively small budgets. Still, by overcoming those limitations, developers came up with some super creative concepts that took full advantage of the hardware that they were running on. Games like Cut to Rope, Angry Birds, Doodle Jump, Fruit Ninja, and Hill Climb Racing all are games that come from what I'd like to call the golden era of mobile gaming. You might have fond memories playing them, and they are probably the games you think of to this day when thinking about good mobile games. All of these games were made so that just about anyone could pick up their phone, get the hang of the controls immediately, play for about 5 minutes or so, have a bit of fun, and then carry on with the rest of their day. They usually revolved around a fun gimmick or gameplay mechanic that in the best cases made for unique experiences that also only made sense to be played on a smartphone. Cut to Rope, for example, is an amazing game from this time period that took full advantage of the touchscreen functionality of smartphones. There are countless well thought out, super creative puzzle levels that not only made for a fun game, but one that only made sense to play on a smartphone. Just imagine how awkward it would be to play Cut to Rope with an Xbox controller, or even with a keyboard and mouse. Doodle Jump, while not nearly as creative or engaging as Cut to Rope, still is a game that takes great advantage of the gyroscope functionality of smartphones, and makes for a unique smartphone game that only would make sense to be played on a phone. Other more straightforward games from this time period didn't push the boundaries as much, but still perfectly captured the charm of the bite-sized, simplistic, casual nature that these games did so well. I'm sure many of you probably have fond memories murdering pigs in Angry Birds, racing through the countless tracks in Hill Climb Racing, or beating levels in Jetpack Joyride. All of the games I mentioned went on to each get hundreds of millions of downloads and become runaway success stories. Mobile gaming was in fact getting so big that there was a popular narrative going around that they were gonna kill portable gaming consoles. For example, mobile gaming was commonly cited as one of the main reasons why Sony's PlayStation Vita was a flop. However, if we take a look at where we are today, this hasn't been the case. Nintendo's hybrid console, the Nintendo Switch, has already sold 100 million units in its first 5 years since launch, and is well on pace to become one of the best-selling consoles of all time. And while the mobile gaming market is at its biggest it's ever been, the reason for that success isn't necessarily that the games have gotten better. So what happened? Today, we'll take a look at the state of mobile gaming today and what led to its downfall. Before I just write these games off completely, I wanted to make sure that I wasn't just being blinded by nostalgia. And well, I wasn't. Searching through the Play Store and going through the top charts, you'll find an endless onslaught of derivative, lazy, offensively bad games that, while raking in millions of downloads, pale in comparison to the masterpieces from the early days. So what exactly went wrong? One of the most common reasons cited for why mobile gaming is in such a bad state is the use of microtransactions. It's one of the most hated game elements out there nowadays, and has even reared its ugly head in AAA games. Sadly, the reason why microtransactions are everywhere is simply because they work. See, back in the day, there wasn't a clear business model laid out yet for developers to squeeze the most money humanly possible out of their players, and it was the norm back then for their games to be purchasable for $1 or $2. Later on, most developers switched over to ad-supported games. A big reason why I think this shift happened is that big boom of people getting their first smartphone and wanting to find all the cool capabilities of what their shiny new device could do has started to fade. The magic was gone. Phones just became tools to help people with their day-to-day life, and there wasn't that need anymore to scour the app store to find that cool new app. Most people only played a handful of games at this point and weren't willing to pay for them. From the beginning of 2011 to the halfway point of that year, Revenue from free-to-play games had jumped up from 39% to 65%, and by 2013 a whopping 92%. Now, most of this revenue didn't just come from the ads. The ad revenue from that 92% figure amounted to just 1%. Due to the lower payout from ads, developers introduced a concept already established by games like Farmville, but not yet popularized, known as microtransactions. The implementation of microtransactions is a business model where users can pay small amounts of money in exchange for virtual items in video games. The use cases for these range from in-game cosmetics, extra content, to in its worst form pay-to-win style elements that give paying users an unfair advantage over others. Only a small subset of players actually make use of these features, and an even smaller set of players spend more than a few dollars. The so-called whales are the approximately 2% of players that spend hundreds to thousands of dollars per month on games, and they are the players that earn developers most of their revenue. Sure, games may have technically become free now, but in exchange for that you have to deal with gambling systems, stamina systems, ads, and in-app purchases. The games being free also allowed them to get away with low quality gameplay and not having a whole lot of effort put into them, since customers needed much less convincing to do to install the games. This led to a downward spiral where games got worse and worse over time and started to grow a pretty bad reputation. Smartphone games are rightfully seen as cash grabby junk. You can see this trend with how whenever major game developers would announce mobile games instead of console releases, they were almost always universally disliked. This in turn made it even harder for passionate developers to make paid high-quality games. Few people were willing to buy them, they might even try to pirate them, and would eventually flock to a worse clone released a week later. The bright side is that smartphones are so powerful nowadays that most indie games can get ported over and run flawlessly. Emulation can let you play anything from Game Boy games to even Wii and 3DS games. Xbox Remote Play gives you access to console releases if you have an internet connection. And there certainly still are some gems out there that don't cram microtransactions down your throat, that inspire many and bring joy to millions. It's certainly not all bad, but that sort of innovative, creative casual game seems to be all but gone. Times have changed. What once was passion now turned into greed. And sadly this won't be changing anytime soon. There would have to be big changes in the way Google and Apple decide what games are allowed into their app stores. As of right now, the bar of entry is so low that just about anything is allowed. Sadly, these changes probably won't be happening anytime soon, as it would mean that they would probably have to exchange a substantial amount of money from these games in exchange for integrity. I hope if one thing, this video inspires you to maybe change the way you browse your games. Like I said, there are still some gems out there, and even if they do cost money, maybe give them a shot. You might have a good time, and if you do, make sure to give them a good review and let them know you appreciate the amazing work that they're doing. Also, please don't spend loads of money on games. You're directly what's enabling them to keep pushing this garbage. It might not make a huge difference, but if we all do our part, maybe things can take a turn for the better.